The silence at 55,000 feet is not truly silent, but a hum of pressurized existence, a vibration that lives in the teeth and the marrow of the bone rather than the ear. Major Elias Thorne sat encapsulated within the glass and composite coffin of the B-21 Raider, callsign Shadow 1, a flying wing that technically did not exist on any radar screen currently sweeping the darkened skies over the Barents Sea. To his right, Captain Sarah Jenkins, the weapons systems officer, was a study in stillness, her gloved hands hovering over the haptic glass interfaces that glowed with a dull, amber low-light emission designed to save their night vision. They were ghosts in a machine built to be a ghost, flying a vector that was mathematically calculated to thread the needle between the overlapping kill zones of the Northern Fleet's air defense network. The mission was not a patrol. It was a provocation, a theoretical exercise turned kinetic, a mandate to dismantle the most advanced shield in the world, the S-500 Prometheus. The objective lay 300 miles south-southeast, nestled in the frozen, hardened geography of the Kola Peninsula. Intelligence had flagged the activation of a new battery, a Prometheus system that the Russians claimed could see the invisible, a system designed specifically to hunt the very platform Thorne was currently piloting. The S-500 was not just a missile launcher, it was a networked intelligence, a multi-spectrum beast of X-band and L-band radars capable of engaging targets in near space. Thorne felt the weight of the aircraft not in drag or G-force, but in the sheer density of the technology surrounding him. The B-21 was smoother than its predecessor, the B-2, smaller but denser, a ceramic and composite arrowhead painted in a radar-absorbent material that was colder than the surrounding air. The air outside was 60 degrees below zero, a lethal vacuum that clawed at the heated skin of the bomber, but inside, the atmosphere was sterile, smelling of recycled oxygen and the faint, ozone scent of high-voltage avionics. Jenkins broke the silence, her voice a flat line over the comms loop, devoid of fear, purely operational. She reported that the passive sensors were picking up the outer ripples of the enemy's search radar. It was the Big Bird acquisition radar, a massive, rotating eye that swept the horizon looking for anomalies. To it, the B-21 should appear as nothing more than a bird, or perhaps a cloud of ice crystals, or ideally, nothing at all. Thorne adjusted the flight path by a fraction of a degree, sliding the aircraft along a pressure ridge in the atmosphere, using the subtle turbulence to mask their entry. The Raider was designed to eat radio waves, to trap them in its honeycomb structures and dissipate them as negligible heat, but the S-500 was designed to look for the holes in the background noise, the absence of signal where there should be static. This was a game of shadows played at Mach 0.8, a chess match where a single mistake meant a hypersonic interceptor missile, moving at 14th, would vaporize them before they could even blink. As they crossed the coastline, the landscape below was a void of black ocean meeting black rock, distinguished only by the faint, jagged line of breaking ice. The B-21's onboard AI, a helper system the crew simply called the Brain, began to categorize the threats. The S-500 was not alone. It was the queen on a board protected by Pawn's 400 batteries, Pantsir point defense systems, and electronic warfare jammers. Jenkins busy managing the electronic spectrum, her fingers across the screens as she tuned the Raider's own electronic countermeasures. They weren't jamming, yet jamming was an admission of presence, a scream in a dark room. Instead, she was engaging in spoofing, feeding the enemy sensors subtle ghost signals, false echoes that appeared and vanished miles away from their actual position, phantom planes that would distract the algorithms hunting them. Thorne watched the threat ring on his tactical display. It was a red circle expanding and contracting as the enemy radar changed modes. They were slipping inside the outer engagement zone now. S-500's engagement radar, the Gravestone, was the real danger. It was a narrow beam illuminator that didn't just search, it locked. If that beam touched them, if it lingered long enough to build a track file, the launch would be instantaneous. Thorne felt the tension in his shoulders, a physical knot contrasting with his relaxed grip on the stick. The Raider flew mostly by itself, a fly-by-wire system making thousands of micro-adjustments per second to maintain stability without a vertical tail. But Thorne had to command the intent. He had to be the will behind the weapon. He pushed the throttle forward almost imperceptibly, urging the craft deeper into the lion's den. 200 miles out, the S-500 battery was now fully alert. The network had sensed something, perhaps a disruption in the background radiation, perhaps a reflection off an open bomb bay door from a commercial airliner miles away that alerted them to look harder. The red circle on the display pulsed. Jenkins murmured that the frequency agitation was increasing. The Russians were switching bands, moving from long-wave search to short-wave targeting. They were nervous. They knew something was out there. The sky around the Raider was filled with invisible energy, beams of microwave radiation sweeping through the dark like searchlights. Thorne imagined he could feel them, hot fingers trying to scrape against the hull of his ship. He focused on his breathing, the rhythmic intake of the mask, the sound of his own life sustaining itself in the hostile dark. Jenkins announced they were at the launch basket for the standoff munitions, but the mission profile called called for a deletion, a hard kill of the radar and command vehicles, not just a suppression. They needed to get closer. They needed to drop the GBU-57s or the new hypersonic cruise missiles from a range that guaranteed no escape. The S-500's interceptors were capable of shooting down incoming missiles, so firing from maximum range gave the system too much time to calculate a solution. They had to close the distance to release the weapons so close, the physics of the intercept became impossible. It was a knife fight in a phone booth, but one combatant was invisible and the other was blindfolded. Thorne confirmed the order to continue the ingress. They were going to 80 miles. At 100 miles, the warning receiver chirped, a low warble that spiked the adrenaline into Thorne's bloodstream. They had been painted. A momentary glint. The gravestone radar had swept over them just for a microsecond. The stealth coding had done its work, scattering the beam, but enough had returned to the source to create a blip, a question mark on a Russian screen. Thorne held his breath. If the radar spat immediately, they were tracked. If it continued its scan, they were safe. The seconds stretched out, elongated by the relativistic speed of fear. The chirp died. The radar had moved on. They were ghosts, but now the enemy was suspicious. The scan rate increased. The sky was becoming a frantic web of searching energy. Jenkins initiated the pre-arm sequence. The belly of the Raider held two types of ordnance. For this run, they were using the AGM-283A, a hypersonic boost glide weapon, but modified for internal carriage. The weapon was a door kicker, designed to smash the radar face, blinding the system so that follow-on strikes could dismantle the launchers. The bay doors were the weak point. Opening them shattered the stealth profile, increasing their radar cross-section by orders of magnitude. They could only open the doors for seconds. Jenkins sensed the release with the radar's rotation speed, timing the drop for the split second when the gravestone's beam was pointed away from them. It was a timing maneuver requiring millisecond precision, handled entirely by the brain. 60 miles. They were dangerously close. Thorne could see the synthetic aperture radar map building a picture of the ground below. The target complex was clear, a cluster of vehicles on a snowy plateau, the massive radar arrays deployed like geometric altars to the god of war. He could see the heat signatures of the generators powering the system, glowing white-hot against the frozen tundra. They were alive, breathing, waiting. The S-500 was a masterpiece of engineering, capable of hitting satellites in orbit, yet it was about to be undone by a subsonic wedge of geometry and math. Thorne felt a strange respect for the adversary, the acknowledgement of one warrior for another's shield, just before he drove a spear through it. Doors coming open in 3, 2, Jenkins said, her voice tightening. The B-21 shuddered slightly as the hydraulics actuated. The atmosphere rushed into the bay. For 2 seconds, they were a barn door on the radar screen. The warning receiver screamed, solid, continuous tone. They were locked. The S-500 had seen the bloom. It had seen them. Thorne didn't flinch. There was no point. The sequence was automated. The heavy weapon dropped from the bay, the trapeze launcher kicking it free into the slipstream. Weapon away? Jenkins called out. Doors closed. The stealth profile was restored, but the secret was out. The S-500 knew they were there. On the ground, the Russian battery commander would be shouting. The automated systems would be slewing the launchers. The 77 and 6N missiles, massive kinetic kill vehicles, would be igniting. But they were reacting to a ghost that had already vanished. The B-21, doors sealed, banked hard left, rolling into a high G turn that pressed Thorne into his seat. The stealth geometry was optimized for head-on and tail-on aspects. The turn exposed their belly slightly, but it was necessary to clear the weapon's flight path and put distance between them and the inevitable counterfire. Thorne watched the tactical display as the AGM-183A ignited its booster. It didn't look like a missile. It looked like a meteor. It accelerated to Mach 5, then Mach 8, then Mach 10 within seconds, climbing into the stratosphere before nosing over to dive. The S-500 radar was now screaming, pouring all its energy into tracking the incoming hypersonic threat. It was designed for this, but the physics were brutal. The missile was moving at over 2 miles per second. The Russian interceptors launched flashes of light on the ground sensors streaking upward in pillars of fire and smoke. It was a race of algorithms. The Russian interceptors tried to predict where the American missile would be, but the AGM-183A was maneuvering, skipping on the atmosphere, changing its trajectory unpredictably. It was not a ballistic arc. It was a guided, jagged line of death. Thorne watched the geometry play out on the screen, a silent observer to the violence he had unleashed. The first Russian interceptor missed. The hypersonic glide vehicle left, pulling 20 Gs, a maneuver no airframe with a pilot could survive. The interceptor couldn't correct its course in time, and it exploded harmlessly in the thin air. The second interceptor was closer, detonating a fragmentation warhead that sprayed shrapnel into the path of the glider. The glider took a hit. Telemetry showed a degradation in control surfaces, but its momentum was unstoppable. It was a kinetic hammer falling from the heavens. It didn't need a warhead. The sheer kinetic energy of the impact would be equivalent to a small tactical nuke. The impact was silent to the crew of Shadow 1, miles away and high above, but the sensors recorded the event. The S-500's engagement radar, the heart of the system, simply ceased to exist. The glider struck it at Mach 6, vaporizing the vehicle. The crew crew, and the electronics in a flash of superheated plasma. A crater the size of a football field replaced the high-tech installation. The shockwave rippled out, flattening the nearby support vehicles, stripping the antennas off the command post, and tossing the massive launch tubes like matchsticks. The delete was absolute. The eye of the Dragon had been gouged out, but the mission wasn't over. The B-21 was still in the kill box, and while the primary radar was gone, the network was still alive. Other radars in the area, inferior but still dangerous, were searching frantically. The S-400 batteries nearby, enraged and blind, began launch-unbearing tactics, firing missiles in the general direction of the B's last known position. Thorne saw the smoke trails rising, searching for him. This was the dangerous phase. They were running the gauntlet. He kept the aircraft low now, dropping altitude to use the curvature of the Earth and the terrain masking, trading the safety of height for the clutter of the ground. The sky outside the canopy was lit by the distant flashes of missile motors. Jenkins was working the electronic warfare suite harder now, pouring jamming noise into the S-400 frequencies, creating a wall of static that blinded the missile's seekers. One missile, a 48N6, managed to burn through the jamming, its seeker locking onto the faint thermal bloom of the B-21's exhaust. The tone in the cockpit changed, a high-pitched warble that indicated inbound mid-window with a lock. "Break right," Jenkins yelled, dumping a canister of thermal decoys. These weren't standard flares. They were pyrophoric clouds that mimicked the exact heat signature of the bomber. Thorne slammed the stick right. The Raider, usually flown with gentle precision, groaned under the stress. The artificial horizon tilted 90 degrees. He pulled back, tightening the turn. The missile, moving at Mach 4, was fooled. It dove into the cloud of chemical, detonating 50 yards off their tail. The shock wave hit them like a physical hammer. The aircraft lurched, the master alarm panel lighting up with amber cautions hydraulic pressure fluctuation, sensor misalignment. But they're still flying. The composite skin held. Thorne wrestled the aircraft back to level flight, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. They were through the worst of it. The missile had been the last gasp of a dying system. Silence returned to the cockpit, heavier this time. The S-500 was gone. The S were firing at phantoms. The B-21 slipped away into the darkness of the Arcanite, a needle returning to the haystack. The mission clock ticked over. They were heading home. Thorne let out a breath he felt he had been holding for an hour. He looked over at Jenkins. She was trembling slightly, the adrenaline crash hitting her, but her hands were steady as she reset the systems for cruise mode. They had just proven that the shield was not impenetrable. They had proven that in the age of advanced warfare, there is no such thing as a safe harbor. The flight back was a long decompression. The brain compiled the bomb damage assessment from the rear-facing sensors. The destruction was total. The data would be analyzed by generals and politicians, used as leverage in treaties and budget hearings, but for Thorne, the reality was the cold sweat drying on his back and the hum of the engines. He looked out at the stars, crisp and unblinking in the thin air. The B-21 Raider was a marvel, terrifying apex of human ingenuity, but it was also just a machine. It was the fragility of the flesh inside that made the mission real. They had walked into the fire and walked out, leaving nothing but smoke and silence behind them. As the coastline of Norway appeared on the navigation display, a friendly green line in a world of hostile red, Thorne allowed himself a moment of reflection. The S-500 Prometheus was named after the Titan who stole fire from the gods. It was a fitting name, he thought, but tonight, the gods had taken the fire back. The Raider, the Shadow, had extinguished the torch. He engaged the autopilot, the tension finally bleeding out of his muscles, and watched the northern lights begin to dance above them, a natural display of light far more powerful and indifferent than any radar beam. The war game was over. The deletion was complete. And somewhere in the dark below, the world had changed, shifted by the unseen passage of a wing that technically, officially, wasn't even there. The debriefing would be exhaustive. Every toggle switch, every decision, every millisecond of radar data would be dissected. But the core truth of the night would remain between Thorne and Jenkins, the feeling of being the prey that decided to bite back. The B-21 landed hours later at a secure airfield, touching down with a screech of tires that sounded like a scream in the quiet night. As they taxied to the hangar, the massive doors rolling open to swallow them back into the secrecy from which they came, Thorne patted the dashboard of the jet. A silent thank you. They were back on the ground, back in reality. But part of him, that had interfaced with the machine and danced with death in the ionosphere, was still up there, circling in the dark, waiting for the next signal, the next target, the next command to delete. The S-500 system was widely touted as the ultimate air defense, a layered bubble of denial that no aircraft could penetrate. It was the pride of the Russian military-industrial complex, a symbol of their ability to challenge American air dominance. Its destruction, therefore, was not just a tactical victory. It was a psychological blow. It shattered the myth of invulnerability. As the intelligence reports began to circulate the next morning, the implications rippled through the global defense community. The Raider had not just destroyed a battery, it had rendered an entire doctrine obsolete. The era of the impenetrable fortress was over. The era of the unseen assassin had fully arrived. And in the Pentagon, in the quiet rooms where the future wars were planned, planned. The success of Shadow 1 confirmed a chilling new reality. If you can be seen, you can be killed, but if you cannot be seen, you can kill anything. Thorne walked away from the jet, the ground crew swarming over it like ants, checking the stealth coating for microscopic abrasions. He pulled off his helmet, the cool night air hitting his sweat-matted hair. He felt unmoored. The transition from the high-stakes environment of the cockpit to the mundane reality of the tarmac was always jarring. He needed coffee, he needed sleep, but mostly he needed to stop hearing the warning receiver's warble in his head. He looked back one last time at the B-21. In the hangar lights, it looked alien, a smooth, featureless slab of future. It looked like it was sleeping. But Thorne knew better. It was waiting. It was always waiting. And somewhere, in another frozen wasteland or desert expanse, another radar was turning, another screen was glowing, and the next target was unknowingly marking its own position, preparing to be deleted. The geopolitical fallout was immediate. The Russian government issued a statement denying the incident, claiming a training accident involving a fuel truck. But the satellite photos told a different story. The crater was too precise, the destruction too total. The military attaché knew. The world leaders knew. A message had been sent. It was a message written in the language of hypersonic physics and radar cross-sections. It said that the sky belonged to the shadows. It said that no matter how high you build your walls, there is always a way over, or under, or through. The S-500 had been a wall. The B-21 was the ghost that walked through it. In the days that followed, Thorne and Jenkins reviewed the mission tapes. They watched the digital reconstruction of the engagement. It looked clinical on the screen, a video game played with symbols and vectors, but they remembered the physical reality. The G-forces, the dry mouth, the sound of the missile launch. They saw the moment the 500 radar acquired them. The red spike that could have been their end. They saw the moment the door kicked open. They saw the impact. It was a strange dissonance, seeing their own near-death experience reduced to data points. Close, Jenkins said, pointing to the interceptor that had exploded near them. Too close. Thorne nodded. That's the job, he said. We get close so the rest don't have to. The deletion of the S-500 was a turning point. It forced a rethink of air defense strategies globally. It accelerated the development of directed energy weapons, quantum radar, and AI-driven swarms. The cat-and-mouse game evolved, becoming faster, deadlier, more automated. But the principle remained the same. It was always about the human in the loop, the pilot who dared to push the throttle, the operator who held their nerve. The machine was the tool, but the will was human. Thorne knew that eventually, the B-21 would be surpassed. A new system would emerge that could track it. A new missile would be built that could catch it, and then a new bomber would be designed to defeat that. It was an endless cycle, a wheel of fire turning in the sky. But for now, for this moment in history, the Raider was the king, and the king had just cleared the board. The narrative of the S-500's demise became a classified legend within the Air Force. Young pilots whispered about the Baron's delete, analyzing the tactics, studying the timing. It became a case study in the War College, a perfect example of SEAD suppression of enemy air defenses executed with surgical precision. But for Thorne, it wasn't a case study. It was a memory of the cold, the dark, and the hum. It was the memory of the moment when he realized that the most powerful weapon in the world wasn't the missile in the bay, or the radar on the ground. It was the silence, the ability to be nothing, the power of the void. The B-21 didn't just carry weapons, it weaponized the unknown. And in the face of the unknown, even the Prometheus, the bringer of fire, was forced to blink. As the weeks turned into months, the tension in the region settled into a new, uneasy equilibrium. The S-500 battery was eventually replaced, but the crew was different, more jumpy, more prone to firing at false alarms. The fear had set in. The psychological delete was permanent. Every time a radar operator in the Northern Fleet looked at a blank screen, they had to wonder, is it really empty? Or is Shadow 1 out there again, watching, waiting, ready to open the door? The doubt was the true victory. The doubt was the weapon that kept the peace, or at least kept the war cold. And Thorne, flying training missions over the Nevada desert, looked up at the same stars he had seen over the Barents Sea and knew that he was part of that doubt. He was the shadow in the corner of the eye. He was the reason they couldn't sleep. He was the delete key, hovering over the world, ready to press down. The technological leap, represented by the B-21, was not merely incremental. It was foundational. The delete mission showcased the integration of sensor fusion at a level never before seen. The aircraft didn't just receive data, it curated it. It didn't just fly, it reasoned. The S-500, for all its brute power and sophisticated phased arrays, was fighting a linear battle against a non-linear opponent. The Russian system relied on the ODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. The B-21 disrupted this loop at the very first stage. Observation. You cannot orient against what you cannot observe. You cannot decide to kill what you cannot find. The engagement was a masterclass in information warfare, where the lack of information was the primary projectile. The kinetic impact of the missile was the punctuation mark and the long sense of electronic silence. Ultimately, the script of modern warfare had been written in the skies that night. The heavy battalions, the armored columns, the static defenses, they all looked suddenly vulnerable, ancient relics of a time when war was visible. The future was invisible. The future was fast. The future was a B-21 raider slipping through the net, proving that in the end, the only thing that truly matters is who sees who first. And as long as the raiders were flying, the United States intended to be the one doing the seeing. The S-500 was deleted not just from the Earth, but from the hierarchy of dominance. It had been demoted from a predator to prey. Raider flew on, a silent sentinel in the high atmosphere, the ultimate arbiter of who gets to stay on the board and who gets removed. The final report filed by Major Thorne was brief. It contained the coordinates, the timestamps, and the BDA. It did not contain the poetry of the flight, the feeling of the stick, or the cold beauty of the kill. Those things belonged to him. They were the pilot's share. He closed the file, locked the safe, and walked out into the bright, harsh sunlight of the desert base. The mission was done. The target was deleted. But the sky was still there. And as long as there was a sky, there would be a need for shadows. Thorne put on his sunglasses, hiding his eyes, and walked toward the horizon. A man who knew the secrets of the dark, ready for the next time the call came to turn the lights out.